We're going to talk tomorrow a lot more about structure. I'm going to show you a few really effective story structures, including the most fundamental, complex business story structure you can do, which is a Wall Street Journal story structure. But this is where most of our worlds start, right? You guys know what this is, right? Inverted pyramid. What's its purpose? Civil War was the first time in the history of the world where journalists were able to cover stories live, pretty much, because they could go out in the field, they could watch the battle, they could come back to the telegraph office and dictate their stories. Telegraph lines were a weapon in the war because you have to have communication, right? So the generals used to communicate back and forth where troops were and all that kind of stuff, and we're sending resupplies. They'd send scouts out into the field to spy on the enemy army and then go back and send in reports. Do the same thing now, we just do it electronically. And that means that one of the things that used to happen in the war is they'd cut down telegraph lines, because that way you cut off communications. Which means you couldn't have an anecdotal lead. You know what an anecdotal lead is, right? A scene to start a story. Because what if you're telling the scene up here and the telegraph line gets cut off and you don't get to the news until here? It's a problem. This is not a natural way for people to absorb information. It's absolutely counter to the way we understand information because it's backwards. We usually start with the conclusion and then we back up and support it. And the way people understand things most naturally is chronologically. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, and it adds up to this, right? So we don't say 4 equals 2 plus 2. We say 2 plus 2 equals. The pyramid is literally inverted, right? It makes sense because it forces us to synthesize and prioritize our information. It's a very good thing to learn how to do, especially if you're working online, fast breaking news, and if you're working for an informational news story where telling people what happened is the most essential thing you can do. But in this day and age, because people move so quickly and they have so much incoming, even if you're going to use an inverted pyramid, which I think is an important structure to know, you have to have your inverted pyramid with the lead, what happened, and immediately follow it up with a summary nut. Do you use the term nut graph? Nut paragraph? Do you use that term? Yes, no? We use this term in the States. It's called a nut graph or a nut section. It basically means the nut of the story, the heart of the story, right? You can think of it as the summary of the story. And even in fast-breaking news stories now, you need to come back with this summary nut almost immediately because, one, people might not know why something's important, and our job is to tell them, to put it in context. And in your world, I'll give you a good example. I work a lot with, I do training with reporters and editors at Reuters in the United States, and I've done some work with them in South America. Probably the most specialized financial reporting and business and economics reporting outlet in the world, right? 93% of Reuters' business comes from selling information to financial traders. And that's how they support the other 7%, which is their journalism. The theory is that Reuters' audience, which is a specialized target audience, understands all that financial gobbledygook, right? So if you read Reuters' stories, they're very heavy with statistics. They're very heavy with jargon from business sectors. And they often don't have a summary nut section. And I go in with them and I say, where's your nut graph? Why am I reading this story? And their answer is always, well, because everybody knows, because our audience knows why this matters. And I'm like, okay, maybe I'm stupid, right? Because I don't get why this matters. They said, well, we're not writing it for you. So then I started doing this. I'd be in a room with 18 reporters from Reuters, and they all covered different sectors of the economy. So I got the oil and gas guy here, and I got the derivatives market guy here, and I got the insurance health industry market guy here. And we're looking at these stories and critiquing them. And I'd go around the room, and the derivatives guy would have written some story about the derivatives market with no summary nut graph. And I'd look at everybody else in the room, and I'd say, do you understand why you're reading this story? These are other reporters at Reuters, and they'd go, we have no idea. Even within their own shop, they need to be told, here's why we're telling this story. So this is what we're going to look at. We're going to look at the tops of stories and some summary nuts. And then, obviously, in an inverted pyramid, you do the lesser information. But you've got to have that summary nut, which means you have to have stopped and figured out what your story's really about, what the purpose of the story is. Some stories you actually want to start with a summary nut lead, where you get rid of any kind of opening scene or anecdote. We'll look at some examples of where you can do that. So I think in this day and age with a fast breaking news story, you want to start with a summary nut lead.
This is a structure for newspaper, for news agency, for magazine, so it's unique for everybody, or you have some questions about
News agencies, definitely. Newspapers, if it's breaking news, definitely. Magazines, if you're breaking news in your magazine, or if you're writing a very tight piece that's informational. Yeah? Right. It's not for storytelling. And it doesn't do much to help people understand the emotional or relevant connection of a story. It's really good for information, right? For imparting information quickly. A jumbo jet crashed off the coast of California this afternoon with 88 people on board. There are no apparent survivors. The plane was heading from Mexico to Seattle when the pilot signaled for help at 12:40 p.m. Officials aren't sure of the cause of the storm. There are reports of turbulence in the area. Transportation safety officials are going to the scene, and questions are being raised about whether or not the airplane, which is a Boeing 737, which has a history of tail rudder problems, was damaged, causing the crash. Boom. There you go. That's the entire story with a nut graph lead, right? Right? You got it all right there. But if you want to tell the story of that day, that isn't going to do you any good. I could pull you up stories from the day the World Trade Centers were hit, boom, 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 and then I could pull up the story from a year later when the New York Times went back and they pulled every possible time-stamped piece of information they could get from that morning, and they wrote a chronological narrative of the morning of the trade crash. And it started at something like 6:11 a.m. when when a woman got a voicemail from her husband, and it was recorded on her phone. And then they went to 6:15 a.m. This happened, and 7:10 p.m. a.m. this happened, and they literally told the morning of that story on a clock. It was a very complex story. You had the firefighters, you had the police, you had 2 airplanes in New York, you had an airplane in Washington, D.C., you got an airplane in Pennsylvania, you have people all over, but they kept it on a clock. That's a structure, and that's a narrative story because it's following the action through time. Okay? So we're going to look at some summary nuts because this is an important thing to understand, and it's difficult for people to do. And the only way you can write a summary nut is if you know why your story matters. What is the significance of your story? So I like to think of summary nuts as containing 3 core elements. And your summary nut can be a sentence, and it can be a paragraph, and it can be a whole section. But somewhere in the top of your story, of any story, whether it's a story or a news story, you have to have 3 main elements. You have to have some connection to the news, the what happened. Or, as we said yesterday, some connection to the issue that's ongoing and newsworthy to the what's happening, right? You have to have some kind of tether to whatever the news or issue is that's driving this story, okay? You have to have some reference to context. Rob talked about this. The context to a story could be economic, it could be political, it could be geographic, it could be historic, it could be social, but you want to put information in a context. Yeah, although the third one, which is significance, is really why you're writing about it, right? Context is where it comes from, what world it lives in. If you're writing about the change in, give me some example from your world. You're writing about the change in the dollarization of the grivna. Does that even happen? Is that like an accurate term? Yeah? Okay. That comes in the context of the softness of the economy in the European Union. Right? Then the other thing, significance, the other thing to think about when you're putting together nut elements is significance. Hi, Diana. Welcome. Folks say hi to Diana Henriquez. Welcome her. Hi there. Yay. The other thing you want to think about is significance. Significance goes to the heart, Tatiana, of why you're writing this story. Why does it matter? How big a deal is it? What is its import? Some people say significance and scope. How many people does it affect? How big a deal is it? But it's literally the so what. And this is what's too often missing from stories, especially specialized beat stories, because the reporter knows why the story matters, and they start assuming that so the public does too. And it's your job to stop and in one authoritative moment, at least, tell them what the information you're telling them where it fits and why it matters, what it represents. Is that making sense? Okay. So we're going to look at a few tops that do this. And then I'm going to give you a couple of stories and have you go through them and identify where in the stories the nut elements might be. Because most stories end up being kind of a mishmash and a dump of information, especially when you're writing fast on deadline. And if all you do in a story is figure out what your summary nut material will be, suddenly the story becomes much clearer and everything starts hanging together. One way to think of it is it's sort of the secret decoder ring that you give the reader that lets them into the secret. Hey, dear reader, you're part of the club now. You understand why I'm telling you this, right? When I do stories, when I struggled with this when I was writing, because focus of a story is a really hard thing to do. You have all this information. Just as your interviews got a little unfocused, then suddenly you have unfocused information, and then you really have trouble focusing a story. So when I did this, I would literally, at the top of my screen, while I was writing, I had three or four things that were little prompts, and I would fill in the blanks before I wrote the story, and they went like this. This story is about, and I'd finish the sentence. This story is about the plane that went down off the coast of California, killing 88 people. It comes from the world of safety in aviation, and everybody is afraid of getting on airplanes. It matters because 88 people are dead. Boeing built that airplane, and Boeing is our biggest employer. And if I could answer those questions very simply, I started to get a notion of what my story was about. The AIDS story. This story is about two gay men who fell in love and died because of it. It comes from the world of HIV/AIDS epidemic and all of the accompanying discrimination and fear. It matters because the number of people who are getting HIV/AIDS in the United States is rising dramatically, and it's tearing this country apart in a battle over whether or not they're moral. There's my story. And once I know that, I can start figuring out, well, how do I want to tell this story? But you've really got to think about this, it matters because. Yvonne articulated during the interviews, yes, for Esquire, not for Forbes, and whether you're conscious about it or not, Yvonne, what he's doing is taking this and not only thinking it matters, but he's thinking the next step about it matters to my readers because. So this is forcing you to think about audience, right? One other way to think about this is this is the moment, you're giving information to readers or to your viewers. You're telling them about something that happened. You're giving them numbers. And this information is layering out pretty quickly, and there's a lot of it there, especially in your stories. There's a lot of numbers. There's a lot of statistics. This is the moment where you stop and you pause and you look up and you say to the readers, here's why I'm telling you all this, and here's the world this lives in, okay? So hang with me. This is what this is part of. So it needs to be very authoritative, and it's literally a summary. Is it making sense? So take a look at, let's look at this. This has got a really clear example. As an anecdotal lead, right? It's a story about one person. This is like the air conditioner lead story. Janice Staheli earns more than $20 an hour. She works from home, and her employer, UW Medical Center, offers health insurance, vacation, a pension, even incentive pay. It's clean, it's crisp, it's short. But at this point, so what? You have no idea what Janice Staheli represents or why you're reading about her. The writer very quickly gets to hey, there's one hitch. Because you're thinking, yeah, Janice Staheli's got a pretty nice life. I wish I made $20 an hour, had vacation, health insurance, a pension, and got to work from home. So, but there's a hitch. Whoa, but wait, dear reader. As a medical transcriptionist who turns doctor's dictation into patient records, her work is highly mobile. All right? I'm still saying, well, so what? So it's hardly surprising that Staheli, 58, and dozens of her colleagues fear losing their jobs to cheaper workers around the country and overseas. Context. Context. This is making Staheli, putting her in the context of other people in her situation. And now you're getting into significance, right? Context and significance, they're often merged. Factory jobs have moved overseas for decades. The process is so well documented, it has a wonky name, deindustrialization. Economists say this transfer cuts costs and enlarges the economic pie. In this virtuous circle, new workers elsewhere earn more money, get better educations, join the global economy, buy U.S. products. And then you get to the big wahoo. But such offshoring spreads into the world of white collars. Those old theories are being questioned anew in ways that are tough to answer. And then the real nut is embedded in those questions. Okay? I wouldn't have any reason to understand why I was reading about Janet Staheli unless the reporter pulled back and said, here's what she represents. Here's the significance. This is a story about deindustrialization and about it finally spreading into the white-collar sector. And it raises implications that we haven't thought of before for thousands and thousands of people and the entire economy. Make sense?